Hello and welcome to another episode of the Classical Republican. Today we're talking about the foreign affairs of classical republicanism. And so today I'm going to be reading heavily from Philip Pettit's books. We have Republicanism, A Theory of Freedom and Government, and also A Political Philosophy in Public Life, Civic Republicanism in Zapatero's Spain. So that book was written last, so we will read from that last. Republicanism was late 90s, and I want to point out that the main virtue that is being upheld here is moderation. And classical Republicans are trying to find the happy median on many of these issues, from defense to diplomacy. So first off, I want to go to Republicanism and read on page 150 at the bottom. External defense. The modern republic, like any form of state, is bound to concern itself with issues of defense against external enemies. Unless the country or city in question is adequately defended, after all, there is going to be a live and continuing prospect of domination from outside. Indeed, to the extent that the country is not adequately defended, another country may dominate it, and thereby dominate its citizens even without actually interfering. It may be in a position to interfere, to invade or threaten, for example, at will and with relative impunity. Republicans will shrink not just from interference and from likely interference, but from the situation where more or less arbitrary interference is within the power of another state. But if Republicans see a major policy challenge in the defense front, it should be clear that they need not think that the proper response is for the Republic to arm itself to the teeth, or even worse, to strike preemptively against potential opponents. What the proper response is will depend on how the Republic can best improve the prospects for non-domination on the international front. And the experience of history surely teaches that the best response is not likely to be the bellicose or aggressive one. The experience is that as states rely more and more on their arms and their armies to inhibit each other, they become hostage to military pressures and logic. So, we don't want to spend too much money on on defense, so much so that it becomes, that starts to dominate the budget. There may not be the specter of the army coup that haunted traditional Republican thinking and led Republicans to favor the citizen militia over the standing army. In many countries, the division of the military into different armed services and the development of a democratic ethos has reduced that prospect considerably. Okay, that's a big issue, going back to, really the ancient republics, especially Rome. And then you see Machiavelli and Harrington talking about it in the Renaissance and early modern era. So so Pettit points out here that instilling a democratic ethos and dividing up the military services, and I'm sure having civilian leadership is also one of the reasons that we do have standing armies today in a lot of republics, in a lot of countries today. Yeah, but let me continue. But there certainly will be a sustained prospect for war as the generals on the different sides assume responsibility for national security and impose on the polity at large a militaristic image of how to discharge that responsibility. When war becomes a sustained prospect and when states defend themselves against one another by threat and counter-threat, then the cause of non-domination is compromised. Even if war does not eventuate, and in war ordinary people suffer the worst extremes of domination, The fact of threat and counter-threat means that each state is actively coercing others. And in any case, the logic of threat and counter-threat means that the different sides have to spend more and more on military defense, that the citizens of the countries in question have to bear those costs, and that the extent of undominated choice that they can then enjoy is severely reduced. We saw earlier that there is a powerful Republican case in favor of resort to the strategy of constitutional provision and against resort, or at least wholesale resort, to the strategy of reciprocal power. This ultimately provides the basis for the Republican argument in favor of having a state. What we now see is that a similar logic applies in the international arena. The strategy of reciprocal power, at least in its military version, looks very unattractive, and Republicans must naturally look for more constitutional provisions. What provisions to seek? Here, there is only a little that we can say that is not exceedingly vulnerable to empirical fortune. It is going to be attractive to the Republican state to establish cultural, economic, and legal networks to the extent that such regional or global systems of relationships inevitably discipline members in the manner of constitutional commitments. It is also going to be attractive for the Republican state to support a body like the United Nations insofar as it promises to be able to contain conflicts and ultimately to make conflicts more and more unlikely. More generally, it is going to be in the interest of the Republican state to encourage different layers of multinational cooperation and institutionalization. The emergence of institutional order, regional and global promises to serve the cause of defense more effectively than exclusive reliance on military capacity. Okay, so talking about international organizations, diplomacy, and we can see that if we look at history, we see that republics like Venice really pushed for diplomacy, and had some of the best diplomats in history in the Middle Ages. Now, in Harrington's Commonwealth of Oceania, he also talks about having like a permanent embassy, which was pretty rare at the time. Yeah, you didn't have a lot of you didn't have permanent embassies. You just sent off ambassadors, and they had maybe a one mission or a portfolio of objectives to achieve with a foreign king usually, and so they would. So diplomacy was very useful to republics to stay out of war. Um, yeah, Harrington has a really interesting idea where they have a rotation, and they have about 4 rotations, and they would go through those. It would usually be a senator, and he would go around on those 4 rotations. I think 2 years in each. Yeah, 2 years in each city, and then would go. Um, let's see, it was like Paris, Venice, Constantinople, and I think one other place. And then they would come back, and they would bring back to the Senate all the interesting perspectives that they learned while they were out representing their country. Let me continue. The Republican state will have to establish itself as a good international citizen, of course, if it is to foster the development of this sort of order. It will need to maintain a military capacity as a last resort. But it had better not flout the shared regional and international sense of what sort of capacity is reasonable. It will need to maintain limits on immigration if it is to retain its current Republican character, and if it is to sustain the Republican ethos that requires. But it had better not show itself indifferent to the plight of immigrants and refugees, or to the difficulties endured by those countries who are struggling to cope with the movements of peoples. It will need to look to its own interests in the development of trading and financial arrangements with other countries, but it had better not adopt a posture of being prepared to give up on every commitment it makes at the first sign of unforeseen cost, and so on. If Republican defense policy points us in the direction of multinational cooperation and institutionalization, if it suggests indeed that the well-defended republic has to be a good international citizen, then it is worth noting that such a policy is likely to merge with the Republican requirements on other fronts. While the Republican state represents an indispensable means of furthering people's non-domination, there is nothing sacred from the Republican point of view about the state or about the state's sovereignty. Given the existence of multinational bodies of various kinds, there are some domestic issues on which it may be better from the point of view of promoting freedom as non-domination to give over control to those bodies and thereby to restrict the local state. Okay, so there's a calculation of non-domination here. You have to figure out if I'm going to join a multinational organization, I'm going to be giving up a certain amount of sovereignty, but how much and what am I going to get in return? It's all based on non-domination and your needs, as goes non-domination. The more distant an agency is from a given issue, it is true, the less well informed it will be on certain aspects. But equally, the more distant an agency is from an issue, the more likely it is to represent an impartial arbiter. That being so, it may be quite a good thing from the Republican point of view that various domestic issues should be taken out of the realm of local decision making and given over to international adjudication. Okay, this is also an argument for federalism, I believe. Should development be allowed in a particular wilderness area? Should homosexuality be legally permitted and homosexuals allowed full civic rights? Should women have the right to work in certain industrial sectors and to earn the same wages as men? It is fairly obvious that on such questions, international bodies and indeed informal international movements may promise to counter local factional interests in a more reliable manner than the domestic state. They may promise to do better in the promotion of freedom as non-domination among the citizens of that state than the state itself. The best Republican policy may well be to expatriate domestic sovereignty in such cases and to give a certain guaranteed weight, if not absolute discretion, to relevant international agencies. In supporting multinational cooperation and institutionalization, Republican defense policy would cohere well with what Republican policy may require in such other areas. Okay, and that's all he says in Republicanism. You know, that's out of 300 pages, and that's all he says. But I think the main ideas are being a good international citizen, non-domination, and moderation. Now, let's go several years later ahead to where he actually did influence a country, Spain, and in 2010 he published this book, A Political Philosophy in Public Life. So this is on page 104, and this is in the appendix to chapter 3, where he's giving an interview, or no, he's giving a press conference, and this is challenges and queries. And a reporter asks Philip Pettit, says, "You do not address the issue of foreign relations in the original lecture. Can you indicate briefly the lines that a Republican philosophy would support? And can you say how far the Zapatero government seems to have been following those lines?" So I'm so very grateful for that journalist, whoever asked that question. And so if you're watching, thank you, and or gracias, because I think this was they had translators translating for Philip Pettit, because these were all Spanish people. And Philip Pettit says, "The international order that a civic republican philosophy would recommend is one in which states that speak and act for their peoples, being democratically controlled in a suitable degree. Okay, so it's not like absolute democracy. That's what he's referring to. It's not complete majoritarianism. Being democratically controlled in a suitable degree, are not subject to the domination of other states or of global bodies like multinational corporations and international agencies. If such states are dominated, then the citizens on whose behalf they speak are dominated too. These states should establish an order in which each enjoys freedom as non-domination and should seek to provide assistance for the members of oppressive and failed states. Such states do not have a claim to freedom as non-domination in their own right, since this might not serve the cause of their members. How might democratic states go about establishing an international order of mutual respect and external assistance? A first requisite is that relatively weaker states should combine in more restricted multilateral associations to ensure that they make common cause against stronger states or against other bodies that would otherwise have an unchecked power of interference in their affairs. Whether that interference be military, economic, or diplomatic in character. And a second is that empowered on this basis, they should combine in bodies where, as partners in dialogue, they authorize common values that can be invoked on all sides, both to regulate their relations with one another and to organize initiatives on behalf of the members of oppressive or failed states. This Republican philosophy of international order is richer than the traditional philosophy that would only give states a right against active military intervention by other states and would ignore the sort of domination that does not require active intervention, military or otherwise, and that may derive from multinational corporations or agencies, not from states. But the philosophy is not so rich as to be utopian. In this respect, it contrasts with calls for cosmopolitan equality or justice. The performance of Spain. Okay, so then he's going to get into Zapatero's the critique of Zapatero here. The performance of Spain over the past 3 years has been fairly true to the principles of the approach. The government has been a staunch defender of the United Nations and other such bodies, arguing for the importance of dialogue and the common understanding and action that this makes possible. A good example of its commitment on this front is the sponsorship with Turkey of the Alliance of Civilizations. Okay, the Alliance of Civilizations is something that Zapatero did during through the UN. This was during the War on Terror to try to open dialogue with people who have very different histories, so culturally and religiously different from you. It remains to be seen how far this venture succeeds, but it is certainly the sort of enterprise that a good Republican citizen of the world ought to be attempting. Again, the efforts that Spain has made in its relations with African and Latin American countries, as well as with Britain over the issue of Gibraltar, evince a commitment to dialogue of the same kind. Has Zapatero's Spain displayed a recognition that despite its own power, it is now the 8th largest economy in the world, the country needs to make common cause with other countries if it is to be safe against the power of multinationals and a country like the United States? I see some signs of its adopting the profile of a state that is willing to provide leadership among countries outside the G8 in international forums. But these are hard to read for sure. Within Europe, I see it as a state that is willing to help develop the culture of cooperation and compromise that is necessary if the European Union is to provide for its peoples. The strong arm or stonewalling tactics that some European leaders are willing to adopt in the name of short-term national interests would undermine the capacity of the European Union in these regards, and it is noteworthy that from the beginning this government has avoided them. One area where common European action will be required, however, is in agreements to maintain corporate taxation levels, preventing multinationals from playing different countries off against one another. It is disappointing in this connection that Spain has allowed a general trend in recently lowering its corporate tax. Finally, I am pleased at the lead that Spain has given in raising its overseas aid by over 25% under the Zapatero government and in continuing to support United Nations peace missions. And indeed, I was pleased at the decision to withdraw from the Iraqi adventure since this was pursued without United Nations sponsorship, and as we know, and as many argued in 2003, was not deserving of such endorsement. Okay, so what he's referring to there is that there was I think it was Al Qaeda terrorist attack, and as Zapatero came to power, he after that attack, he pulled all Spanish forces out of the Middle East, and so they were not a part of the Operation Enduring Freedom or Iraqi freedom in Iraq. So what he so at the time, the world was so focused, or at least in the United States, the media was so focused on the war on terror and what was going on in the Middle East. And so when I remember hearing about that, and remember hearing about the Spanish having a terrorist attack and then pulling out of the Middle East, and the main analysis was that Spain was just giving the terrorists what they wanted. But now that we look back upon it, if the United States had not had so many forces in Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East, Al Qaeda would not have attacked on 9/11. So that's really interesting to see. So Republican foreign policy is not supposed to be completely isolationist, but it's not supposed to be open borders or anything like that. And I was really surprised that he really he says that we can't have too much immigration. That's I think that's coming from a European who has seen a lot of immigration in the past few decades, really um, maybe change the character of certain European nations. But so that's you see that debate going on in a lot of countries, and even in the United States, on how much immigration there should be. But you cannot turn your back on the plight of those in need. So with that, I conclude my video on classical republicanism and foreign affairs. So long live the Republic.